Shabbat Shalom. Tisha B'Av is coming up. We are in the 9 days from the beginning of Rosh Chodesh Av until Tisha B'Av. This is a time of mourning, but also a time of reflection. So I thought maybe we would do a little reflection, but there is too much to reflect upon if we want to do everything. So we're going to do a little bit of a slice. We're going to do a little bit of a narrative reconstruction of narratives that perhaps we don't remember or we're unfamiliar with in the first place. So let's start off with the narrative that we might know best. What is the dominant historical narrative among Christianity regarding us? All right, I know it's hard to put ourselves into someone else's shoes, and also it's important to remember that from the 20th century onward, a lot of these narratives shifted that we're talking about, but prior to the 20th century, there was a general agreement among most Christian denominations of what the Jews were and what our place in the world was. Anyone want to fill us in a little?
We were once favored by God, but were too blind or foolish to recognize the changing situation.
We were once favored by God. We were the chosen people, and that was great. God brought us into the land of Israel, and then, somewhere around the year 0, God incarnated in human form, and the majority of the Jews at the time went, no, we don't believe that. And because of our blindness, our stupidity, our pig-headed stubbornness, we were therefore rejected. The title of chosen was removed and was given to Christians, which is why it's always a little rich when we get accused of being chauvinistic for calling ourselves the chosen people when so do they, as do all other universalistic, militaristic religions. So Jews were now persona non grata, but that wasn't the extent of our role within Christian theology. We were also the example, right? We were the dugma. We were the example of what happens if you don't accept Jesus. That as Christianity began to spread, other nations would say, well, I'm very interested in your sales pitch here, but you told me what happens if I agree, which is that I have all of the sin that you say I have removed because Jesus died. But what happens if I don't agree? What is the opposite example? To which the Christians could say, aha, have you seen the Jews? Have you seen how horrible their lives are? How they are kept in the lowest caste of our society, how thousands and thousands were taken and carted off as slaves, how they are treated and humiliated by us constantly. That's what happens if you don't sign on the dotted line. Indeed, Augustine, later canonized as a saint for these types of ideas, said that the Christians were not allowed to exterminate the Jews completely because they needed us as evidence of God's wrath for those that rejected Jesus. Do we accept this narrative as true? No. I didn't think I'd find anybody in a sanctuary accepting this narrative as true. If we accepted that narrative as true, it would be awfully hard to remain Jewish in your outlook and life. Okay, so that's their narrative. It's not our narrative. Very good. Let's try narrative number 2. What is the Muslim narrative regarding the Jews? I'm talking historically. Don't get me into 20th century, 21st century politics. I'm talking about theologically, what is the narrative? Not what is said by ayatollahs and others that have political axes to grind. What was said 1,000 years ago about the Jew within the Muslim narrative? We were children of Abraham, right? Ishmael and Isaac, very good. And we rejected Muhammad as the true and last prophet of God. And not only did we reject Muhammad when we should have acknowledged that he indeed was a true prophet of God, but we also falsified our own documents. That we falsified the Torah, that we edited whatever God had given us, which they believed that Moses was also a true prophet, but we had perverted the teachings that Moses had given us, and we had become a bastardized version of the revelation, that God had actually handed to us, which is, of course, why we were reprehensible, miserable, and should be humiliated within their countries as well, and kept as third-class citizens at best. So, the narrative is actually quite similar, without the deification of a mortal, but the idea that there was a new revelation, and the new revelation was one that we said, no thank you, and because we were so stupid to say no thank you, it is only inevitable that our status in life is going to be diminished and reduced and held up as an example. As Islam continued to spread across North Africa into Europe and across the Middle East, it was easy to point to those who rejected Muslim teachings as why you wanted to accept Muslim teachings, not just because of the rightness of their words, but because the consequences of rejecting the dominant imperialistic Islamic theology, well, that was living like a Jew. And no one wanted to do that if they could avoid it. The fact that our situation in both the Muslim and Christian worlds that was so dire to be used as a cautionary tale was caused by the imperialist movements of these empires, that was in the small print at the bottom of the brochure. Do we accept the Islamic narrative about our place in the world? No, absolutely not. I would expect that you'd be at a mosque if you believe that. We say no. Look, for both of our cousins, for both Christians as well as Muslims, we say, look, you've got your take on the world. We've got our narrative on the world. We're not expecting you to accept ours. Why do you expect us to accept yours? This has been a fundamental disagreement and distinction between Judaism and our cousin religions. Judaism has, from the beginning, been willing to accept that others believe differently, with some exceptions. Throwing babies into fire, no, we're not okay with that just because of religious freedom. But those are the crimes of Molech. But we, not so much. We're going to tell everyone you had to be Jewish. There was no great imperialistic drive by the Israelites to conquer all of the lands. We just read that we were told by God, and we practiced what God had told us, to tell our neighbors, we've got no beef with you. Hey, you're from Esau? Great, keep your land. You're from Lot? Great, keep your lands. Even the kings of Sichon and Og, the great kings of those other nations that were not immediately part of our family and family tree, we still said, hey, we just want to pass through. We're going back to our house, where we're probably going to have a scuffle with the people who are living, but we have no beef with you because you're not living in our home. And therefore, just let us pass. Unfortunately, most of them had trouble with that, but we never once said, your land gets to be our land too. And so does the land beyond it, and so does the land beyond it, and while we take over it, you will all be forcibly moved into Jewish theology, and if you don't, you'll end up on the wrong end of a spear. Judaism was not only not a proselytizing religion, it was not an imperialistic religion. It was the earliest example, really, of true universalistic pluralism. Not just, our God is God for everyone, and we're going to kill you and prove it, but our God is the God of everyone, but if you don't believe that, well, you do you, and we think you'd be better off believing it, and we'd be happy to help you understand it, and we think eventually you're going to come to your senses, but in the meantime, you do you. And we see this actually not only at the time of our crossing over into the land of Israel and going through all of these territories as outlined in this part of Devarim, but we saw it at the very beginning. Who did God first make a covenant with that set all of this family tree into motion? Abraham, right? Avraham Avinu, Abraham our father, who was the father not only of Isaac, from which we came, but also the father of Ishmael, from which, theologically, we believe the Islamic peoples came as well, and which they believe they came from. Great. We also know that Abraham was given all of the land of Canaan, the land that would eventually be called Israel after the name of his grandson Jacob. And yet, how did Abraham behave with the people who lived in the land at that time? When it came time to bury his beloved wife Sarah, what did he do? He bought a cave. Now, that is very moving and touching and a great lesson of how we mourn for those that pass in our lives. But think for a moment about the narrative. He bought a cave. In Abraham's mind, he's buying land that he already owns. Who's he buying it from? That guy doesn't own it. Abraham owns it. How does Abraham know he owns it? Because God told him to. Because that's his narrative. In Abraham's narrative, the cave already belongs to him, as does the entire village, as does everything from river to sea. But does he actually come and take the land? No. He buys it. Now you may be thinking, oh yes, but he's only Abraham. He's just a guy. He wouldn't be able to seize property if he wanted it. Really? Did you not read a few chapters prior where he led a war party against a coalition of kings that had already overwhelmed the mighty cities of the plain, such as Sodom and Gomorrah? And Abraham won where they lost? Yes, Abraham could have taken this had he wished, but he was not prepared to force the locals to accept his narrative, even though he believed it. He also wasn't willing to let them, their not acceptance of his narrative, drive him out of the land of Canaan. He wasn't going to just go home because no one believed him. He found a way to make it work. The land is mine, but I will pay you for it. My people will be buried here, but I will do so in a way that you will recognize the legitimacy of it, so that there won't be cause for me to muster my military force and go after you the way I had to in order to rescue my cousin Lot when he was, or nephew Lot, when he was being held hostage. Abraham tried to find it work, and he did the same over wells and Beersheba, and so did Isaac, and so did Jacob when he was nervous about the situation in Shechem, time and time again. The patriarchs who lived in the land of Canaan prior to our time in Egypt showed respect, but not obseisance, to those who were in charge of the land in a titular way at that time. We never lost our narrative, but we also never lost sight of the fact that the other people in the land also existed, and that we therefore had to navigate that relationship with those who didn't accept our narrative in a way that wasn't predicated on violence as the first resort, but only the last resort. And then hundreds of years later, we see as we come back into the land, it is exactly the same pattern again. We know our narrative. It is the promise to Abraham that still inspired our people when they were leaving Egypt. It is still that promise that was able to convince them that Moses was in fact speaking on behalf of God. It is that promise that makes them understand that just as Edom and all of the other Moabite and Ammonite places will have their promised land, that we will have ours. But even as we acknowledge that their right to their land is promised by our God as well, we are never so foolish as to expect them to accept our narrative in return. Because that's not how it works. There are competing and often conflicting, and more often than not, contradictory narratives among the peoples of the world, and certainly in the modern world, among religions. So, that doesn't mean we have to check our narrative and see whether or not our narrative is wrong or flawed. No, our narrative is our narrative, and their narrative is their narrative. And we will not resort to the violence of imposing our narrative the way the Islamic and Christian empires did for thousands of years. We're not backing down, but we're also not expecting people to sign on the line and join up with our story of the universe. So what's the alternative? The alternative is to follow the way of Abraham, to follow the way of Isaac, to follow the way of Jacob, to follow the way that we just read Moses outlining again, after having seen it also play out during the reading of the book of Numbers directly. You offer peace. You offer emissaries to say, look, we will pay for what we want, but we're coming through. We will not change the direction that we are headed, but we will offer solutions that will allow you and us to live in peace in a way that doesn't require you to accept our narrative or us to forget who we are because you don't agree with our narrative. If that fails, then yes, then there's going to be a certain amount of unfortunate scuffling which can escalate into bloodshed and war, as we see with Sihon and Og, for example, throughout this portion of the recap. But it doesn't have to be that. And even when we enter the land of Canaan, the land where we are most expecting that the locals are not only not going to accept our narrative, but also not want to find a way to compromise and work this out. Nonetheless, what does God tell us later on in the book of Devarim? When you approach a city to besiege it, of your enemies, those that hate you, you still offer peace. You still offer peace. They may not accept it. Indeed, most Canaanites did not. But you still offer peace. And if they refuse, then yes, you are allowed to fight for what is yours. You are allowed to fight for your slice of this globe, which is so enormous and for which we want so little. But you start always with the offer of peace, and you look for an opportunity to find a way to make that reconciliation, not by accepting their narrative and not forcing them to accept ours, but instead recognizing the existence of all. We exist, they exist. The Canaanites are there, we are there. Yes, we have a right because God gave it to us, but no, we are not so benighted with our own faith that we imagine everyone else in the world will recognize that. Instead, God tells us how to handle that situation. Now, is that easy? No. Does it still lead to war? Unfortunately, yes. But there are steps to take before war is initiated. And there are steps to take to try and bring war to its conclusion. And Judaism believes that despite the strength of our faith, despite the strength with which we hold on to Israel as, indeed, our God-given slice of this beautiful planet, that we still have to actually work with other humans who don't agree with that message. Now, I know that's frustrating, especially right now coming back to the 21st century in a time of war. No one wants to hear that we should actually talk to people. And yet, didn't we just read that in the Torah? Did we not? Is it some weird modern fetish that we want to have peace? No. 3,000 years ago, on the threshold of what was going to be a potential catastrophic war or a potential reclaiming of our land, God still is teaching us, you offer peace. You offer, we'll pay for this. We will follow these rules in order to avoid confrontation. We will not stir ourselves up against you lest we needlessly engage in battle that could have been so simply avoided. But it's not some modern liberal idea. That's Torah. And Torah tells us to do that in times of peace and in times of war. It tells us when necessary to prosecute a war with all the strength that we have in order that we will be able to win and come out the other side secure in what we have gained. But that end goal does not have to come only through conflict. If others force it upon us, then so be it. But that does not mean that we should join the long list of imperial religious groups that throughout history have demanded others accept their narrative. We do not want to be like the empires in history of Christianity and Islam, and of other faiths as well, for which we don't have time to go into. Because we are Jews, and our narrative says that's not how we do it. Yes, we get the job done when they force us, but we will not start at that point, and we will not, once started, say that now there are no other options. Because God has told us there is always another option. We need partners, but that doesn't mean we stop looking. Shabbat Shalom.